Welcome back to Unveiling the Covenants, where we explore the mysteries of sacred scripture, the covenant love of God the Father from the heart of the church. I'm Marcus Peter. Today we're talking about the flood narrative, but instead of going through the biblical narrative, I wanted to talk about some historical evidence we have of the flood. So just to recap past episodes, Genesis 6 to Genesis 9, we see this great narrative of God calling Noah out to be the mediator of this new covenant in this new creation order of the flood. And in the flood, God is seeking to establish Noah as a new Adam, like I mentioned, new mediator, through whom God is going to propagate the rest of the human species. When you take a look at Genesis 6 to 9, you're going to see that this question of God's judgment, its establishment, it's a very detailed narrative. You know, you've got certain specifics, like 40 days of rain and the ark landing on Mount Ararat. Now, some of these are symbolic details, but the fact of the matter is it is enough of a narrative that it posits one reality, which is that there was a cosmic recompense, if you will, for the sin of man, and so the wiping out of mankind. The question is, did the flood really happen? Now, my answer to that is yes, but we need to understand that correctly. Was there a flood that flooded the entire globe? Sort of yes and no. The truth is, as I've mentioned in previous episodes, there are numerous flood narratives that take place from kind of the central Near East all the way to the Far East that show us that in that same era, there might well have been a copious flood, a massive flood that brought about the destruction of numerous lives. The Chinese have it, the Epic of Gilgamesh has it, this is Akkadian, the Indians have a flood narrative. All of this would go so far as to posit that maybe a real flood did happen, and we have archaeological evidence to lean us in the direction that there's some veracity to the claim. So let's talk about this. Number one, the Mesopotamian flood accounts. Now these predate Genesis. There are significant parallels to the Genesis narrative, and many people posit that the narrative with Noah was borrowed in terms of narrative details from the Mesopotamian narrative. Regardless of how you believe it, what you do need to understand is Noah was a real person. And through him, the propagation of the human species continued. But most of all, that you can trace a genealogy all the way to Noah, all the way back to Adam. And so we know that in some veracity of claim, Noah was in fact a real person. And the Jewish people can trace their lineage all the way to Noah. Now, what we can say then that the Mesopotamian account informed the Genesis flood account. So the Epic of Gilgamesh, this was written in 2100 BC. Utnapishtim is the name of the character here, who is the Noah-like character. He is warned by, in this case, the god Ea to build a boat. He takes animals and family on board. The flood lasts, in this case, several days and not 40 straight days. And he sends out a dove, swallow, and raven, which is very similar to the Noah narrative. The boat, however, lands on Mount Nisir. And scholars posit it might be the origin of a lot of Near Eastern flood traditions. Unlike the Noah narrative, however, it doesn't possess the same liturgical details. 7 pairs of clean animals, 2 pairs of unclean animals. It doesn't possess the same priestly language when speaking about Noah, because when Utnapishtim gets off the boat after several days of being on a flood, and it's described as a large, almost circular boat. When he gets off the boat, there's no instance of him offering liturgical sacrifice to God in worship, but there's also no language of a covenant, and this is crucial. For the Mesopotamian account, Utnapishtim is appeared to by one of many gods. Ea, he's one of the many idols that the Mesopotamians worshipped. And because of that, there's no language of a covenant that's signed between the God of the universe and this human person. The narrative we find in Genesis, however, is so specific, because God does, in fact, want to covenant himself to humanity and to espouse humanity to himself, and he uses, in this case in history, Noah to do it. And that distinction is crucial, because unlike the narrative with Utnapishtim, where his family survives, the narrative with Noah speaks about a salvific narrative for the rest of humanity in the person of Noah, and in a covenanted order where there's a liturgical form and sacrifice that will be offered in worship of God and in faithfulness to all the children of the covenant. There's nothing like that in the Mesopotamian narrative. We go on from there to speak about evidence at Shuruppak and Kish. Now, these are both Mesopotamian sites, and archaeologists have found that there were flood layers that correspond roughly to the 3rd millennium BC. So it presents itself in a consistency to 2100 BC where we find the text of Utnapishtim and the Epic of Gilgamesh. And these are often cited as physical evidences for major geological flood, regional flood narratives with geological evidence. This could have inspired Gilgamesh, and this could also be evidence for the fact that there was a massive flood in that entire region. And so the Mesopotamian flood narrative doesn't negate the Jewish flood narrative. Rather, it creates further corroborating evidence that there was a great enough flood that different cultures experienced it differently. We go on from there to discover what's known as the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis. Now, archaeologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman posited this in 1997. They suggested that a massive flooding event around 5600 BC, where the Mediterranean Sea breached a natural dam and flooded the Black Sea basin. Now, this might have inspired many of the Near Eastern flood narratives because this flooding created saltwater pockets within the area past the dam from the Mediterranean Sea. And in fact, the archaeological evidence posits that rapid and catastrophic nature of this flood left a major impact on oral traditions in the entire surrounding area that is close to the Mediterranean Sea, which includes, as I might mention, the Jewish narrative. So we know here that we have geological evidence, we have archaeological evidence that supports a grand flood narrative in that entire region surrounding the Mediterranean Sea. As I mentioned, the Mesopotamian flood account is one of many. But think about the historical and geological evidence. Sediment cores and geological records, for example, so cores from Mesopotamia, the Persian Gulf, the Black Sea, all of these show evidence of not a gradual flood, but a kind of sudden flood. 40 days of raining is, in fact, sudden by means of historical narratives and even geological evidence. And so sudden floods and even a kind of shift in the climate structure at the time of the flood, therefore rain, 40 straight days of rain. These align with known flood deposits in other ancient settlements that surround the Mediterranean Sea area. Climate change and glacial melt that were post-ice age. Now, I'm not arguing for any modern climate change narratives. I don't want to get into the weeds of that now. Rather, this is just demonstrable changes in the climate and glacial melt. Because around the 10,000 to 6,000 BC range, sea levels did in fact rise, and we have archaeological evidence that proves this, geological evidence that proves this. Glaciers melted and caused displacement, and that displacement actually caused flooding in numerous areas. One of the areas we see this really happen even during that era was really largely the Mediterranean Sea area. So again, we're returning to that geographical area in global history. And so oral traditions of people who have survived those flood narratives continue, in fact, to some degree to this very day. And likely, they turned the traumatic event, and so the survivors turned the traumatic event into narratives of gods who helped them survive. In whatever way, shape, or form they could see themselves, even if they survive by means of natural reason, they would ascribe their survival to some kind of divine intervention. Now let's go back again to archaeological evidence of history and narratives. We have what's known as the Atrahasis epic. This was in the 18th century BC. It's a very detailed early version of the flood myth. So this man named Atrahasis, he's instructed to build an ark. He's asked to survive a divine flood, and the purpose of the flood, however, is different. It's not meant to hold man to moral account. Rather, it's meant to stop the human species because of overpopulation. So you see this disdain for the dignity of human life and the treatment of human life as one numerical factor. And there's a stark difference between the Jewish narrative and the Atrahasis epic. It also gives a narrative of divine regret post-flood. I regret the God that is mentioned in the Atrahasis epic. It talks about how he regrets killing off so many people. It's different than the narrative in Scripture because it doesn't say that God regretted killing off the people at the time. Rather, that God regretted creating human beings because sin had propagated the world. Now, I've mentioned before, this doesn't mean that God in his heart is specifically able to regret. Rather, it's anthropomorphization of the divine person. And so this regret is ascribed to teach us lessons about the compassion of God. However, in the Atrahasis narrative, this one amongst many gods expresses a kind of regret for what he has done. You also have the Sumerian king list. It mentions a great flood between different lists of kings before and after the great flood narrative. What this indicates is there was a flood. It was a real chronological marker in ancient Sumerian tradition as well. Again, we're looking at that region surrounding the Mediterranean Sea historically, all the way up till the 2100 BC era and just before that as well. Other ancient flood myths, Greek mythology. So you've got the Deucalion and Pyrrha. They survive a flood that's sent by Zeus, and they repopulate the earth, which is matching the Jewish narrative. Hindu texts. So you've got the Satapatha Brahmana, you've got the Mahabharata. I've read the Mahabharata before. Manu is warned by a fish, which was, a manifestation of the idol Vishnu, one of the many idols they worship, to build a boat and escape a worldwide flood. But you also have the Mayan, Chinese, and Aboriginal myths, which I mentioned earlier. Also Indian myths. All of these contain references to massive floods, and all of them ascribe it to a kind of judgment of the divine. Now, the consistency of the historical narratives from the Near East all the way to the Far East tells the ancient Near East all the way to the ancient Far East tells us that at least we have geographical, geological, and archaeological evidence. A great flood did in fact happen. And so when we take a look at the archaeological evidence, that area that is now kind of known as the Persia. It used to be known as Ur of the Chaldeans, and they have found silt layer 8 feet thick between two distinct civilization layers, and it dates to about, again, just before 2100 BC. This is 3000 BC. And so it's interpreted as a flood silt layer. And a catastrophic flood at that, because the cores that have been dug up demonstrate a widespreadedness of the silt, which demonstrates a flood did in fact happen in that era, in that time. Now, going back again to language of archaeological, geological evidence, as I mentioned, the Black Sea deluge hypothesis, it's actually one of the most compelling scientific theories of our day that proves a great flood event in that entire area. Geologists, like I mentioned, William Ryan, Walter Pittman, both of them from Columbia University, by the way. Now, they also posit that some other great flood narratives happened in about 5600 BC. The rising Mediterranean Sea breached natural land barriers, but we also have supporting evidence, submerged shorelines, freshwater to saltwater transition that's found in sediment cores in the Black Sea, human habitation sites that have been found underwater along ancient coastlines that used to be dry land. Dating corresponds to early Neolithic human settlements. And so the significance of all this proves that given that certain range, and I know it's wide enough, we can see that there were truly some great flood narratives. And I could go deeper. Flood layers at ancient cities, Shuruppak, Kish, as I mentioned before. But the correlation is that Shuruppak, as I mentioned, is in the Sumerian kings list. And so all of this goes back to the grander narrative of Noah, the Near Eastern flood. Essentially, as we consider all of these narratives, what we do see is that there were mega floods throughout that area and even surrounding areas. For example, Lake Missoula floods, this was in the United States, and roughly during this era as well. Floodwaters reached speeds of 60 miles per hour to heights of 400 feet. The Yellow River floods in China, the Nile, the Indus, the Danube floods. So civilizations across the globe recorded catastrophic floods in their early history. And the Mesopotamian floods, as I mentioned, the Tigris, the Euphrates, and their basins, the basins of these rivers, all of them have documented flood evidence. Why am I sharing with you all of this? Because it's just so easy to debunk the biblical narrative. It's so easy to say, well, that's all myth. No, I'm proving to you, I could actually go on. All of this proves, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that great flood narratives happened. And like I mentioned, some of the greatest civilizations, Mesopotamian, Akkadian, Chinese, Indian, natives of the different areas, Sumerian, and of course the Jewish civilization, but also the Canaanite civilization, most of which has been wiped out, the Arabic civilization in that region, all of them have early great flood narratives. This wasn't just a gradual flood that suddenly came and went away. This was a flood that wiped out an inordinate amount of people. And this teaches us a valuable lesson, because in every one of the narratives I just mentioned, plus every one of the archaeological evidences and geological evidences I've mentioned, all of them prove one thing, that when there's a religious reason ascribed to it, it is always God showed judgment on the people. And it wasn't the God, it was a God. Even the Greek narrative holds that to be true. The Roman narrative borrows from the Greek narrative, changes the names, but it's the same thing. The Jewish tradition, however, speaks about a God. Number one, he is the God of the universe. Number two, and he's also a God of love. And he's also a God of the covenant. And so when he calls Noah to himself, he's calling Noah to a very specific bond with him that none of the other early flood narratives possess. Having gone through all these evidence, what I can show you is that when you use the historical, critical, literary approach to reading Genesis, you can see that the flood narrative is part of a broader, Near Eastern and Far Eastern great flood narrative with its own unique distinction that none of the other narratives have. A God of love who intervened in Israel's life long before Israel came to be, to bring about the Israel that we come to see in the scriptures, and the Israelites that we see today, the Israelis that we see today, descended of the same people. Notes parallel in all of these narratives, but the key distinction is that the Jewish uniqueness is about the God of the covenant. And before you say, well, the Jewish people wrote it for themselves, no, think about this. The uniqueness of that narrative is such that it was prophetic. Because unlike all of the other narratives, there was no Messiah to come and fulfill it. Christ comes, and now the flood of the Old Testament becomes the waters of baptism in the New Testament. The Ark of the Old Covenant becomes the church of the New Testament, which saves believers. The liturgy of the Old Testament becomes the Eucharist of the New Testament. The sacrifice of Noah of the Old Testament becomes the sacrifice of Christ on the cross in the New Testament. Noah, his bride, and his children become prefigures of the members of the church. The marriage of Noah is now propagated into the family model, which becomes the model of the domestic church. None of the other narratives have even remotely close to that kind of a theological depth. And mind you, I've studied them. I can attest to that firsthand, which tells us one core thing. When we take a look at the flood narrative, we can see the loving heart of a father who refuses to give up on man, his creation, even though he could. Because the biblical theological perspective is how we ought to view this. I can present you a myriad of evidences. None of that will matter if we don't understand the heart of the God behind that evidence. And that is why we have to think about the flood narrative as a literal event. Yes, you heard me say it. We have to think about the flood narrative as a literal event. And so reading the text of Genesis 6-9 from a literal perspective tells us there was a flood. Archaeological, geological, geographical evidence proves there was a great flood. Numerous textual evidences prove there was a great flood. And the God of the universe wanted to save mankind from extinction. More than anything, the God of the universe wants mankind to be free of sin and free to live in covenant and grace. That, my friends, is the lesson we ought to learn from the flood narrative. Now, I've shared all of this with you so that you can know that the faith we profess is not a myth. Yes, it is majestic, but it is not a myth. It is rooted in truth. There's an historical reality to the faith we profess. I can go into the scientific evidence for the fact that there is a scientific Adam and scientific Eve. I can go into numerous arguments for the historicity of a lot of the biblical narratives. And then the question becomes, well, how did the miracles happen? God, in His grace, temporarily suspends natural law for the sake of His divine glory, working out salvation history for us. So when you take a look at the flood narrative, know that you are taking a look at the love of God. Know that you are taking a look at a grand, great flood narrative in which your story was also written. God had you in mind, even through the flood. And so the waters that brought death in the old covenant become the waters that bring life in the new covenant. And so all of the archaeological bases, the historical bases that I've mentioned, they create the stage for the theological reality of the love of God that transcends human existence, that also transcends material creation, and yet that pierces through the veil to intervene in the matters of human life so that you and I can be won over to God. And that's why, as I mentioned in past episodes, and I'll mention again, when you take a look at the end of the flood narrative, you get the great covenant. And with that covenant, never again shall all flesh be cut off by the waters of the flood. Never again shall there be a flood to destroy the earth. That covenant promise has been held true. None of the other narratives that I mentioned had a God that covenanted himself with that promise. Have you seen a great flood throughout history since that point that has wiped out huge swaths of human population? No. God is Lord over nature, and he preserves us by means of his promise. But I want to take it even deeper than that. God then also says that there's sacredness to blood. And so he says this, "For your lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. Of every beast I will require it, and of man and of every man's brother I will require the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image. And you, be fruitful and multiply, bring forth abundantly on the earth and multiply it." This is the reiteration of the dignity of human life, which again, you don't see in the other historical flood narratives. The reason for this is because none of the other ancient Near Eastern religions and Far Eastern religions had a God who was the one true God. And so they might have been worshiping demons, they might have worshipped idols made by human hands, regardless. None of their mythologies had a God that honored the dignity of human life, which is so foundational to the Old Covenant, New Covenant, Old Testament, New Testament narrative of salvation history that God has used to write your salvation and my salvation in. And so when we take a look at the historical narrative, rather than get shaken up, we ought to stand in confidence that the God of the universe chose you and I in the dignity of our life to be forefront and paramount. And so even when he wipes out man in their sins, he still has their eternal salvation in mind. And that's why the church has never said those who died in the flood are perished. The church has never said that. The church has never said they're condemned to hell. So we trust in the mercy of God that he knows in his justice what is best to do. Because lifeblood is precious to God. Life is precious to God. And then God says, go forth, be fruitful and multiply. Because the conjugal embrace within marriage is reordered to covenant sanctification once again, which is another thing you don't see in other Near Eastern and Far Eastern narratives. So what can we learn from the flood narrative? Number one, a great flood did happen. Numerous cultures, science, history prove it true. But number two, we are the only ones with the truest narrative, the most expansive, objective narrative of that flood, where the God of the covenant, the God of the universe, saved mankind so that he could draw mankind back to himself. And this is my challenge to you, that as you move forth from the flood narrative and you see the nations descended from Noah, and you see all of the other narratives that come out, the Tower of Babel, the call of Abram, all of these, know that you are looking at a God who will not relent saving mankind from his own sin. The God who created us without our foreknowledge will not save us without our consent. The God who created us without our foreknowledge will not save us without our consent. And so despite this massive deluge, Noah is saved because he says yes to the Lord. Noah was known as one who was righteous in his time. So if the Lord looks at us right now, as he has worked through history, he looks at this point in history and looks at you and me, and he asks, will you be righteous in your time? That, my friends, is the real call. If history proves the flood narrative true, then history must also bear witness. The love of God that saved us is equally true. And that is the lesson I want to leave for all of us. Because you can pick up, by the way, all of these narratives, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the evidence at Shuruppak and Kish, all of the geological evidences. You can also pick up, for example, the other flood narratives in the Greek mythology, Hindu texts, like I mentioned, the Satapatha, the Brahmana, the Mahabharata, the Mayan, Chinese, and Aboriginal myths, the Indian myth. You can pick up all of that. And what you will not see is the love of God. But then if you pick up the Christian scriptures, the Old and New Covenant, you will see a God who covenants himself and says this: when the bow is in the clouds, I will look upon it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And God said to Noah, this is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is upon the earth. Look at the flood narrative, look at all this evidence, and know one thing: your Father loves you. Look at this text and know this: you were written into this story. Your Father in heaven loves you. And so even if mankind abandons you, God had you in mind. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Marcus Peter.